a minute. Let's see what the job market's like. So jobs and fairly decent money for SQL Server database administrators. Right? Some of those jobs over 6 figures are up in and around. So if you're an administrator, you're dealing with security and performance for sure, would be huge parts of your job, as well as all the administration. Here's one. What's this? DBA for BlackBerry. You can also get a certification, a Microsoft DBA certification in SQL Server. I've got a bunch of exams. All right, 3+ years. Soon, few years from now. Okay, so we've got our database set up. Actually, there was a couple other things I wanted to point out quickly. So there's a few different metrics. I wanted to do a search to see where does SQL Server stand in the marketplace with its competition. So I've got a couple of different numbers here. So this is one ranking, and you can really see that what the big three are. So Oracle, MySQL, and SQL Server, right? All pretty close in terms of market share. Everything else far distant to these. So that's one metric. This one's a little different, but it's current. So this is the commercial market only, Oracle the biggest player, but Microsoft, that would be SQL Server. That's the second biggest in terms of market share. Notice we really don't see MySQL with a significant share of the commercial and enterprise level. It dominates at the small scale application level, but not at large scale for business. And this one does, they update this every year. Gartner does this and publishes this survey. Now, he also mentioned in the video that the vast majority of the database skills you've already learned in the relational database class are transferable to working with SQL Server. There are a few small differences. We probably won't come across them here because we won't be writing our own SQL, but SQL Server has its own kind of flavor of SQL that's called TSQL or Transact SQL. I would say 95% of the SQL commands you already know how to use would work in SQL Server. There are a few small differences. So for example, I'll just connect to my Azure database for a minute, and I'll show you a couple of the little differences. So I'll just connect to my Thursday. I'll write a new query. So I'll show you two of the most common differences. If I select my database. If this was MySQL, here I can make this bigger. If I wanted to write a query to get the top 10 out, to get the first 10 albums in the albums table, well, first I'll just select everything. It tells me there's 246 rows. If this was a MySQL database, how would I get just the first 10? What would I use? This doesn't actually work in Transact SQL. So the version of this in Transact SQL would be this. Select top 10 and then the columns we want. That's one of the tiny differences. One of the other differences, actually, let me just go in here and look in the Object Explorer. We'll just look at the table from the design view. What do we use in MySQL if we want the database to automatically assign numeric values to a column? What's the property we would set on that column? Yeah, we'd set the auto increment. SQL Server has an equivalent, but it's not called auto increment. So if we try and use the auto increment command, it's going to throw an error. It's not recognized. So if I go into this table, we'll actually see the transact SQL equivalent instead. Hopefully it will show up for us. Okay. So we can see here all the properties. So on my album ID, we won't see any property here that says auto increment. What we see instead is this property, identity specification. And we can even set in design view here, let's say we want, rather than starting at 1, we want to start our first record at 100,000. We would just change the seed, which defaults to 1. We would change that to some other number, and then that would be our starting number. And same with the increment. If we don't want to increment in ones, we want to increment by, let's say, hundreds, we could just change those values here. So the equivalent is called identity. So that's what we would set, is the identity. That does our auto incrementing. It's the equivalent. So those are probably, of all the time I've worked with SQL Server, which is a long time now, 20 plus years, those are about the 2 most significant differences between SQL Server and MySQL, is the auto increment, identity, and the limit and top functions. Almost everything else we do, it's probably going to be pretty much the same. Okay, so I put this link up here. I'm not going to show this to you for reference. We're going to do this, and I'm recording it, but just in case you need another reference, on the MSDN, they have this little walkthrough. So we're basically going to go through this process. It's a 6-minute video, but I just threw the link up here so you can refer to it in the future. So this is how, when we have an ASP.NET web application, we have an existing database, how we can wire them up together using Visual Studio. Okay, we don't have to write any code to do this at all, which is great. So let's open up Visual Studio. I'm going to run mine as administrator, just so I don't have any permissions issues. And let's open up our music store. You just right-click any table. So first you double-click your database, and it will add it in Object Explorer. Okay. So it will look like this. It'll be contracted. So you expand your database, expand tables, and then you just right-click any table and you choose Design. That brings up the Visual Table Designer.
If you want to create the tables, then also we can do it by selecting the database, or like
you select the database and click Tables, and then you just right-click and choose New Table, and then it brings up the Designer window. So you can create a table with the Designer for your assignment, or you can create a new query and you can write create table commands. The Designer is easier, right? You don't have to worry about SQL syntax or anything like that. So for the assignment, make a new database, go in and say new table. So for your primary key field, of course, you'll uncheck this. You want to set it as a primary key. Just click the button. And then for my ID, we'll want to make sure that we turn on the identity. So I'll just expand here and double click. So now auto incrementing is on starting at 1. And
where do we get the table name?
when you save it, it'll prompt you. You'll go in, you'll create your fields, just click save. Save it. So you can write a create table command if you want. This is much easier. Even when you go to save, it'll prompt Devon. When you go to save, it prompts you if you haven't saved it. So you can just, if I say yes, it'll bring up the dialog box asking me to name the table. So I'll open up my music store.
was intense. How many gigs of
The world's deepest folder tree right there.
Yes. What time are we taking the break?
15 minutes after you'd like to break. You already had your break, Joel. Everyone else gets a break, but you can catch up the 15 minutes you missed.
It doesn't really count when you left every second.
Okay, so we want to set our site up in about a half an hour, if you're lucky. So we want to connect. First thing we want to do, we have this connection string. So actually, sorry, let me close it. If you don't have your web.config file open, we need to open that up. So it's right down here at the bottom of the web project, right above the unit test project. So open up web.config. And in here, Visual Studio auto-generates a connection string to a local DB instance, which it calls default connection. Now, we either want to rename this attribute or we want to delete this because we're going to create a new connection that's linked to our own SQL database, and we want to use this name default connection. The reason why is later on when we add our authentication code, it automatically checks for a database connection called default connection. So we won't have to override those settings if we keep that name. I'm just going to get rid of this. I'm just going to get rid of lines 12 and 13 so we have no database connection string at all. So either get rid of it or rename the name property from default connection to something else. Yesterday's class, I renamed it to default connection old. I think today I'll just get rid of it. Now, we don't need to write our own connection string. We're going to let Visual Studio help us with this. So first we want to click over here on our Server Explorer. Most of you will have this option. If you don't see it, you can get it from the View menu. It's the 5th option. So either use the link on the top left if you see it, and if you don't, just grab it from the View menu and open up Server Explorer. So we get this. Right-click Data Connections and choose Add Connection. Now, you probably have another box popping up first asking you what type of connection do you want. So which option are you going to pick? Yeah, Microsoft SQL Server. So we can connect to other types of databases, but SQL Server is going to be the preference. And there's a checkbox at the bottom left that says, like, always use this option. You can check that. We're not going to connect to any other kind of database besides SQL Server. So the next time you do it, like in your assignment, you won't get that first box. It'll just take you straight here.
Are you using 2017?
Mm-hmm.
The first box that you got, did you choose it for the data provider?
Yeah. So on yours, you have to choose SQL Server and then click the checkbox that says always use this provider. Then the next time you won't get that first box. It won't ask you again what type of provider. It will just default to SQL Server. When you set it up, if you click change, it brings you back here. Now your server name, you need to get this either from the Azure panel or from the document I asked you to create last week, which has your database credentials. Because I said, remember, you're going to need all the credentials. So if I click on my database here in Azure, this is the server name. So, and it's got a copy feature right here. So copy the server name, paste it into the server name box here. If you're connecting to a local server, then the server name is just local in round brackets. Also, if you're connecting locally, you can leave the authentication as Windows authentication. But if you're connecting to Azure, Windows authentication is no good. We need SQL Server authentication. This is where you need the username and password you created last week, which is why I asked you to put it in a file somewhere. So I think I've got mine. So I created my little text file. So grab the credentials. Grab your username and password. Now there's two more important steps here. The first one is make sure you click Save My Password. Otherwise, every time it connects, you try to connect, it's going to prompt you for the password. We want it to store that password in Visual Studio. The last step, and I had a couple students miss this part yesterday, so they were able to connect, but they couldn't see their database, is you now have to choose your database name. And it loads. Don't choose master, choose the name of your database, because that's the one we populated with the music store tables. So your server name, your login, and the database name. Then you can click Test Connection just to make sure that your authentication works and Visual Studio can successfully access your database. So I'll leave this screen up for a minute so you can see all of the options. If you forgot your password, you'll have to reset it in the Azure panel. If you don't remember the username and password. If you forgot it, then where do we have to go? Somewhere in here, you'll have to reset the user.
Rich, mine's not showing the database, the database name.
When you click the drop down?
Yeah. It's just showing a blank field.
What's the name of your database? Start typing it and see if it comes, if it recognizes it after the first few characters.
There's the SQL.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, just type the full name. That's weird it didn't come up, but type the actual database name in the box. Quick test. Let's just see what the error is.
Oh yeah, Rich, I forgot to mention to you.
Sorry, just hang on 1 second. Verify that it's configured to allow remote connections. So if you get an error trying to test and you're sure your credentials are right, the first thing to check is whether or not you opened up the firewall on Azure to allow remote connections. By default, Azure SQL Server databases don't allow remote connections. So we did this last week, but to check it, so if you're having this issue like Keith is, on the main overview page of your database, click Set Server Firewall. Last week, I created a rule called All that allowed remote connections from any IP.
Oh, so can I use yours? No.
Can you use my database? Why don't you have your own database?
Because my subscription is not active.
Okay, have you contacted Microsoft?
I sent them a support.
Okay, wait.
And if we have all there, then
So you already had the firewall rule
Yeah.
set up? And you could connect through Management Studio, right? When you were in my office, we looked.
Yeah.
And you connected through Management Studio.
but now Management Studio is showing me the question mark on the Azure.
It does connections do timeout. Double click it and see if it reconnects. See if you can get it in Management Studio.
Login failed too. And credentials, right?
Okay. If you can't connect through Visual Studio, so Dan, you're having the same issue as Keith, try in Management Studio. See if you can connect here. If you open Management Studio and try connecting, see if it allows you in.
No. Server wasn't found or accessible.
See your firewall? Okay, allow access. Go back to Management Studio. Okay, welcome back to the Azure portal. That looks like an issue on Azure. Okay, close this tab. This is fine. Oh wait, unsaved edits. Did you change anything?
Yeah, it automatically added one, and I just did it, but it's
Okay.
the all was already.
You know, sorry. And this was working when you were in the office, wasn't it?
Yeah. Could try relogging in with that. That would log that.
Click on restore for a minute. The restore option here. We can try that, but the issue is we can't access it.
What's going on with yours?
I got mine. The connection is good, and then when it goes down to select your database name.
Yep.
There. So now pick the DB. There. Yeah, we test connection. There, it's fine.
Okay.
Does anybody still need to see the screen, or can I click OK?
I want to see that as well.
Now we can actually see, you don't have to use Management Studio. Once, if you're able to connect through Visual Studio, if you click on Server Explorer now, we can actually see the database right in here. And we can write a new query. If I right click, we've got the option to write queries right here. Generally speaking, I don't recommend it. I don't usually use Visual Studio as an interface to my database for two reasons. One, it's slow. It's much faster. Management Studio is much faster. And two, the functionality is very limited in Visual Studio. You can look at the table, you can run a query, but that's about it. Any of the other tools are not available to us. So some developers just do everything through Visual Studio. I find it's kind of limiting. So typically when I'm building, I have both Visual Studio open, but I use Management Studio for the database. Okay, so we've got our connection stored in Visual Studio, but it's still not integrated into our web project. There's still no connection. So to do this, we're going to use a library or a tool called the Entity Framework. Okay. Entity Framework is what's called an ORM tool. Has anybody ever heard of this, seen this acronym, ORM? Know what it means? Anybody have any idea what it means? Well, I'll give you a hint. Entity Framework is used as the interface or the bridge between our web application and our database. So the M stands for mapping. remote. Good guess. So we're mapping certain things in our web project to certain things in our database. What are those two things we're mapping? One is an O, one is an R. Yeah, so it's an object relation mapper. So what this allows us to do is interface a table in the database with a class in our web application and do conversion and move data back and forth between them. And it will automate a lot of stuff. Okay. So there are many other ORM tools. It's not specific to Microsoft or SQL Server. Entity Frameworks, Microsoft recommended. They created this as an ORM tool. There's a lot of other ones on the market for different types of applications, different types of databases. So we're going to use Entity Framework as this bridge. Kind of like in PHP, we use the PDO library. That was our interface between our MySQL database and our PHP code. Except it's just simply a simple data access library. It doesn't do this object relational mapping. PDO is not that sophisticated.
I cannot connect to your database.
What error do you get? Just make sure you have the credentials right. I mean, I'm connected, so obviously it's online.
Does it have a limit to how many people can be on the server?
Nope. No, it doesn't. So we're going to use the Entity Framework. So we're going to go up. We haven't really, actually, the first thing we need to do, we created these couple of models last week, album and genre. We're going to blow these away because we're going to let Entity Framework auto-generate the model, the classes based on our database. So let's delete album and delete genre. So we don't need those. So here's how we connect it to our database. I realize a few people are having connection problems. I am recording this so you can go through the process again. And also there's the link to the Microsoft tutorial online as well. So I'm going to right-click model folder, and I'm going to choose add a new item. Now it brings me up to the web templates. What we want is not a web file. We want to go into the data menu. And what we want is this first option, an ADO.NET entity data model. So this is going to use Entity Framework. So ADO, which was ripped off by PHP, they call their library PDO. That was based on ADO, which is much, much older, called ActiveX Data Object. So we're going to pick this, and we're going to name this our music store model. So this is going to generate a class that inherits from Microsoft's DBContext class. It does everything to do, it takes care of all the plumbing in terms of accessing our database. We don't have to write any code. So click add. And now we've got 4 different ways we can do this. We actually want this version. We want code first from database. Create a code first model from an existing database. We're going to choose the connection and the settings and which objects in our database we want to include in the model. Our database is small. We only have 6 tables, so we're going to include all of them in one model. If we had a really sophisticated database with 100 tables, we probably wouldn't want them all in one model. We'd probably create a series of different models and put the related tables together to organize it. So click next. And now it says, which connection do we want to use? Well, here's my Azure server. I'm going to choose yes, include the credentials in this connection string. It shows us what the connection string is going to look like. I'm going to check this box that says save it to web.config because we want it to write the connection string for us. I'm just going to make one change down at the bottom. I'm going to call this, in Pascal case, default connection with no space.
If we have our database connected in our Visual Studio, then we don't need the studio management database to be connected, right? You don't,
yeah, you don't need it. I find it's more useful, but you don't have to have Management Studio open. So just choose yes here and save our connection string as default connection and click next. So now it shows us all of the tables. It's asking which tables do you want to include, do you want us to model? The answer is all of them, so I'll just click the checkbox beside tables. Let's include all those tables. We can also model views. We're not really worried about that. We don't have any views. And I'll leave this checkbox and click finish. So this is going to add the connection string to web.config. It will create a class for managing our database connection, and it will generate 6 classes in the models folder, each one mapped to the corresponding table in SQL Server.
Why is that bringing up all those tables?
Okay, bear with me for a second. I may have to redo it. If you get this screen, if web.config's open, it's written code to web.config. It'll give you this saying, do you want to reload it? Say yes, or yes to all, either one. So now in web.config, it's added default connection, and it writes the connection string for us. So we don't have to write that connection string. We'll just let the wizard do it. Now I got an error, so I don't know that my models got built. Oh, it did. Gave me an error, but it built them. So I'm just going to ignore that error. So now we can see what's here. The music store model, it inherits from class DBContext. So this is Microsoft's built-in object for connecting to a SQL Server database. If we want to inspect this, if we want to see the definition of any class in Visual Studio, Microsoft gives us a really good tool. Right-click it and choose Go to Definition. And here is the here's the class called DBContext with all the methods. So here are all the different overloaded methods of how we connect. So it creates objects of type DBSet of each one of our models. And it also includes the relationships that we set up in the database. So which is the one side, which is the many, whether they're required and whether cascading delete. So whatever relationships we set up with foreign keys in the database, they get included here automatically. And then here are our models. So here's our genre model based on the genre table. And it sets up the properties. It matches field lengths. It also will tell us, so if a field was marked as not null in the database, it adds a required decorator to that property in the model. So we don't have to build these classes anymore. And we'll just let the entity framework wizard generate them. Get to your question in just 1 second. Now there's one gotcha with this. So this works great. This saved us a ton of time, right? Build the tables, use the ORM tool to generate the classes. And if we decide we need a new column in the table, where should we change it? So if our albums, we suddenly want a new field in here. Should we add it in here? In our class? Should we add it in the database table? Should we do it in both? The answer is no. We basically have to choose. Microsoft doesn't want us to mix code first and database first. If we use database first, that means not only are we creating the classes from the database, it means if we make changes, we have to make them in the database and then regenerate any models. If we go in and change this, we're going to get a conflict error saying your project is using database first and you're trying to change the auto-generated files. So we would want to make our change in the database and then redo that particular model. is how we want to do it. We'll do that later on in the course, not today. Krupa, you had a question.
By changing the default connection, I'm not able to it's showing an error. Default connection conflicts with that existing property name in the application settings.
Okay, so that means you did not delete the original default connection that was in this file. Look carefully through the file. It must be there somewhere. If it's saying there's an object that there's already a property with that name, it's probably already in there. So you need to remove the default connection and redo the process. So we're going to do one more quick thing and then we're going to take a break. I'm going to open up my store controller and I want to disable all the code we wrote last week. We're now connected up to our database. So instead of mocking up the 10 genre records, we should be able to use our genre model to get real data instead. And we shouldn't have to change anything on our view. As long as we pass an object called genres to the view. I guess I should start my server. I'll just start without debugging. We can replace this loop with one line of code. We'll start it up. I'll click on store. So here are our fake genres. So we want to replace this with the actual data in our SQL server. So in our index method, I'm just going to comment this out, which gives me an error here because I've disabled my variable. If you want to get these comment and uncomment buttons in the toolbar, it's very helpful. Just highlight a block of code, comment or uncomment. If you don't have these, you can turn this on. You click on View Toolbars and check Enable the Text Editor. It gives you the comment and uncomment buttons, which I find are helpful. So you can just enable View Toolbars, Text Editor, and you get those buttons. So now we're going to use our So we'll still get a variable called genres, but running a simple query is super easy with Entity Framework. We don't need to write an SQL command. We don't need to connect. Oh, actually, sorry, we do need to connect first. I'll just pause my statement there. Let's go up here for a minute. Inside my controller class, we'll open a connection here. So anytime this controller gets instantiated, connect. And then that connection's available for any of the methods. So if we refer to our music store model, that just instantiates our database connection. The connection string is automatically pulled from web.config. So that's our connect. Nice and simple, much easier than doing this with a PDO command. So now we just want to use this connection to run a query. So I'll finish my line. Now if I call DB, I'll use my genre model and call toList. That's it. We don't have to write any select statement. It uses the model and it fetches a list of all the data in that table. So we disabled this code. We've added our connection and this one code line. If you build now and click on your store, we should get the actual list of genres now, rather than genre 1, 2, 3. We'll come back to this and do more with it, but it is about time for us to take a break. I just want to make sure I did it right and that it works. So the new lines are lines 13 and 28. So these should get replaced now with actual data. Well, it's been exactly 30 minutes since I told Joel we'll take a break in 30 minutes. So I'm going to stop my video stream. I will push what I've done so far to GitHub. So if you need to reference it, I'll put it online and we'll come back at 12:40.